Is. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I see people are coming on. So welcome to our summer education and employment training series. We're excited to offer 6 free webinars. We are on our 5th going down. So we've already had one, or we're on our 2nd one. So we have already have one webinar that Emily has presented last week, and that was on the MDR process and school discipline. That was recorded and that will be posted on our website soon. These free webinars were designed to empower families, students, professionals with tools and information to support success in school and beyond. And our goal is to provide practical strategies and resources that you can begin to use right away. Before we begin, I'd briefly like to introduce myself. My name is Tammy Sebastian, and I am a special education advocate with Disability Rights Ohio. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman in my 50s with shoulder length blonde hair, and I am also joining you from my home office today. To support accessibility, today's session includes closed caption, and at the bottom middle of your screen, you can click that button up. It's kind of over to your right, the closed caption button. And then also, again, we will be recording this and posting this on the website afterwards. You're welcome today to place your questions in the Q&A or raise your hand. Emily likes a very interactive audience, so please ask your questions and we will be asking them, unless there's a lot of them and we will have to bring back on that a little bit, but we will definitely take your questions in Q&A. Please do not put them in the chat. We do not have the chat available on today's webinar. And we also will, I think Emily will leave some time at the end to address your questions. So today's session will run about 45 minutes. And so with no further ado, I will hand it over to Emily, and she will be guiding us through today's topic, and I'll let her introduce that.
Thank you so much, Tammy, and thank you everyone for being here. Yes, I love questions. If we get a lot of questions, we might have you guys hold questions until the end. I do want to remind everyone that we're recording this, so please don't ask any questions that have like personal information in them. Also, we cannot answer any questions that would constitute legal advice. So if you're asking like a hyper-specific question looking for legal advice, you're better off probably calling our office and seeing if you can talk to one of us one-on-one. So let me go ahead and start the presentation. All right, I'm hoping you can see slides. Let's actually go to the first slide. So today our topic is IEP basics, advocacy, and back to school tips. I'm your presenter today. My name is Emily Durrell. I am a special education attorney at Disability Rights Ohio, and I'm actually coming up on my 5-year anniversary of 5 years doing this work. So I have a little bit of expertise. A little bit about Disability Rights Ohio. If you didn't know, we're a nonprofit corporation with a mission to advocate for all Ohioans with disabilities. We do that in a bunch of different areas. Obviously, I'm in the education team, but we also have like employment teams, abuse and neglect, community integration, anything you can imagine. So if you have a disability related issue, we really encourage you guys to reach out. This is the roadmap of what we'll be talking about today. So this is kind of going to be a refresher and also some advice for starting a new school year. So we're going to go over some special education basics, and I actually lied to you a little bit because we're going to talk about Section 504 and not just IEPs, because I think it's important to know about both. We're also going to talk about how to be a good advocate, like what is the role of a parent advocate? How do you communicate? How do you use data? How do you negotiate in a way that's collaborative? And then we're going to go through some back to school tips, and we have a little workshop. It's actually more in the advocacy section, but just a heads up, there is a little participation section. We're going to be talking about emails. So if you want to participate, then I encourage you guys to get involved in the Q&A section or raise your hands. So first, let's just look at the laws that are protecting students with disabilities. There are three main bodies of law. There's Title III, which is ADA. So that's like about accessibility, ramps into the classroom, stuff like that. There's also Section 504, which is equal access. So that's prohibiting discrimination against people with disabilities. And then there's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. And that's the law where IEPs come from that guarantee the right to a free, appropriate public education and specially designed instruction to help students achieve that appropriate education. There are also additional state laws under those federal laws that kind of like make things more specific. I know in Ohio, one specific state law we have is that parents have to consent to a placement change. Other states don't have that, but we do. So let's talk about just these two. We're going to talk about Section 504 and we're going to talk about IDEA. And we're going to start with Section 504. Once again, I think it's important to understand both of these laws because a lot of times parents, they know what an IEP does maybe, but they don't know what a 504 plan does. And maybe they think one is superior to the other. I just like to make everyone informed on what they actually are and their differences and how, both of them are useful documents in their own way. So Section 504 is a protection provided by the Rehabilitation Act. It prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. And Section 504 is going to apply to any program or service that receives federal funding. So obviously public schools, community and charter schools, but also private schools that receive federal funding students can have Section 504 protections. Who is going to qualify for a 504 protection? It's any student who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And then you can look in that text box there. I put some examples of what a major life activity could be. Breathing, walking, talking, seeing, hearing, a lot of things that we see in schools like learning, uh, communicating, concentrating, thinking, stuff like that. Another important part of Section 504 is you don't have to have a diagnosis to get the protections of Section 504. You just have to be regarded as having this type of impairment, or you can have a record of having this impairment. So sometimes parents think like, oh, my child doesn't have a diagnosis from a doctor. Can they be protected against discrimination? The answer is yes, as long as they're regarded or have a record of having an impairment in one of their major life activities. So the way that a school is going to make sure that a student with one of these impairments there is not being discriminated against is by developing a Section 504 plan. What a Section 504 plan is a list of accommodations and modifications that would allow a student to learn in a regular classroom. So I also wanted to add a little caveat here. A student can still be protected against discrimination and not qualify for a Section 504 plan. So we might have a student who maybe they have been diagnosed with autism, but they function perfectly well in a classroom. They still can't be bullied for having autism. They would still be protected against that level of discrimination. Let's move on to IDEA now. This is the law that you're probably familiar with because this is the law that gives us IEPs. IDEA is a federal law that requires schools to provide a free, appropriate public education to students with disabilities. If a student has a qualifying disability under IDEA that would lead to the need for specialized instruction, then the school has to develop an IEP or an individualized education plan, formalizing the individualized services the student will receive. Who qualifies for an IEP? The student has to have one of 13 qualifying disabilities, and the disability has to affect the child's educational performance and or their ability to learn and benefit from the general education curriculum, leading to the need for specialized instruction. So those 13 qualifying disabilities, it's not like a list of like, what's an example? It's not like you have to have ADHD or you have to have a wheelchair or you have to have, no, it's more broad than that. So I gave some examples down below. These are the more common ones I see, but there's 13 of these categories. OHI is one that's like limited strength, vitality, or alertness, including a heightened alertness to environmental stimuli that results in limited alertness with respect to the educational environment. As you can see, that's a very broad definition, and a lot of things can fit in that definition. Most often, I'm seeing a student with ADHD that's impacting their education, probably would be in this category. Another category you might see is emotional disturbance, which is an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or other health factors. So like this is kind of a miscellaneous category if you have like an emotional disturbance. The big thing to remember with IDEA is there has to be an educational impact for a student to qualify. So if you think about my example earlier, a student with autism, but there's no educational impact, they're functioning completely normally in the classroom, they can socialize with all their peers, that student probably would not qualify for an IEP because there's no educational impact. There's some other IDE requirements that I just like everyone to be aware of. Least restrictive environment, here's an acronym to keep in your brain. It's the legal preference that students with disabilities be educated alongside their non-disabled peers. So least restrictive environment would mean the environment as close to the general education environment as possible. If you're looking at placement in a more restrictive setting, like a separate classroom or a separate school or home instruction, the school district, if they want to make that placement, would have to have data to support that that's what the student needs in order to learn. Another thing that I like everyone to be aware of is child find. So child find is the proactive obligation of all school districts to identify students residing within their school district, even students who are homeschooled or private school students, who they suspect of having an IDEA qualifying disability. So if there's a school or if there's a student residing in that school district who may qualify for an IEP, it's on the school district to seek out those students and identify them and hold an evaluation. Schools are also obligated to hold a meeting to discuss whether or not a student has a suspected disability if the parent requests an initial evaluation for an IEP in writing. So if any of you are out there, you want to get on an IEP, you want to get on a 504 plan, you don't really know where to start, usually you should just start by reaching out to your school district and asking if they can do an initial evaluation. And at the very least, they have to hold a suspected disability meeting to talk about why or why not that student might be eligible. So let's talk a little bit about what is an IEP. There's like 5 main sections to the IEP. There's going to be information and data. There's going to be the actual educational goals. There's going to be the related services. There's going to be specially designed instruction, and there's going to be accommodations and modifications. There are also a bunch of other things in the IEP, but it would take too long to go through all of them. We're just going to hit these main points. So information and data.
Emily, before you get started, do you want a question?
Oh yeah, if we have questions, hit
We
me.
do. So under the definition of emotional disturbance, who makes the determination that a student does not have a sensory need that could explain the disability?
So any determination about category is going to happen during an evaluation meeting. So evaluation meeting is when a psychologist and other people, other professionals, they've done assessments, maybe they've interviewed the parent, and they've gathered all this data on what are the students' strengths, what are the students' needs. And then the team all sits together and identifies, based on this data, do we think the student would qualify for this category or that category? So if they're looking at sensory needs, hopefully they've done like an OT has done a sensory panel or something. They would have a data to show whether or not the student's educational output is due to that sensory need. Hopefully that answers your question. In short, the team decides.
Yeah. Yeah. And then that was the question, who makes the determination? So I think you answered it. Thanks, Emily.
Right. And the parent is a member of that team too, I should say.
Emily, there's actually another question.
Yeah.
That just popped up, and it's around educational impact. Can you explain this more? Also, child find, how would a disability be suspected?
Yeah, actually, let's go back to what slide did I talk about educational impact? Here. So educational impact, that's actually a really good question because a lot of people think it's restricted to academic impact. Obviously, if a student is struggling in like reading, writing, or math due to their disability, that's an obvious educational impact. However, there is a more broad definition. Educational impact is anything that's affecting their ability to function in school. So a lot of times there are social educational impacts, like if the student is struggling to interact with peers, struggling to make friends, that could be an educational impact. The student struggling to communicate their needs, that's an educational impact. They might need some speech therapy, some functional communication help. If the student's having behavioral struggles in school, they can't sit and focus for 30 minutes straight and do their work. That's definitely an educational impact. So in short, anything that's affecting the educational environment would be an educational impact. And what was the second part of that question, Kristen?
It was about child find. How would a disability be suspected?
How would a disability be suspected? That's another good question. So a disability should be suspected if there is an educational impact and the teacher suspects it's related to that student's disability. So if this teacher notices a student is struggling, that should set off a light bulb in the teacher's head. Oh, we might suspect the student has a disability. However, I really highly encourage parents, if you notice issues and you think it might be related to your student's disability, to make that proactive step to reach out to the school and say, I actually think there might be a disability. Can we look into this? The suspected disability meeting is just when everybody is getting into one room and talking about what have we noticed, what have we seen, what is the data, like what are his grades looking like, is the teacher noticing anything in the class? And then based on that, the team will then decide, do we want to look into this further? And if so, they can do an evaluation. Hopefully that answers that question. Where was I? Data? Yes. Information and data. So the IEP, like I actually already talked about ETRs a little earlier answering your question, but this is what starts off the whole IEP is there is an evaluation to see what are the students' needs, what are the students' strengths, what are the weaknesses. The school has to do this before starting that initial IEP and then every 3 years afterwards. So there's always going to be relatively current data. Parents can also request an early ETR if you want fresh data or if the student has a new diagnosis or if you're noticing new issues in school. You might just want to request an early ETR to get all that updated data. Every IEP should include ETR data, but there are other sources of data that an IEP can include. So the present level of performance is the data that's included with every goal. And also stuff like testing scores, grades, those are all like forms of data that should be included in the IEP. Educational goals. This is the second section I wanted to talk about with IEPs. IEP goals are developed in areas of educational need. So the reading, math, writing, with the academic stuff, like I mentioned, but not just academic. Other educational needs can be met by these educational goals. So social emotional needs, executive functioning needs, adaptive behavior, independent living skills, self-advocacy, all these areas can be addressed by an IEP goal. There are also related service goals. So related service like speech, OT, or physical therapy or counseling, those can also be goals in the IEP. What are related services? Those are basically educational services that are provided by specialists who have special degree or special license, special training. So like speech, that's provided by a speech therapist. Occupational therapy is performed by an occupational therapist. Those are all related services. And I gave examples of some more. Another thing you'll commonly see in an IEP is what's called a consultative service, and this is an area of confusion, so I wanted to pull this out as well. Consultative service is when a specialist is consulting with the staff working directly with the student, but will not deliver instruction to the student. So for example, let's say the student has sensory needs. Occupational therapist might be on as a consultative service provider, where they're telling the teacher like, hey, this is the student's sensory diet. These are like some accommodations that the student might benefit from in your classroom. These are some things you can do to make sure he's staying regulated. But they're not working directly with the student on addressing those sensory concerns. They're working with the teacher on how they can set up the environment to best support the student. Specially designed instruction. This is like the real meat and potatoes of the IEP. This is how we're going to work on these goals. We're going to provide specially designed instruction in the goal areas to address the student's unique needs. Specially designed instruction is provided by an intervention specialist or one of those related service providers. So an example of specially designed instruction would be, let's say the student has a need in reading, they're not reading at grade level, they would have an IS meet with them one-on-one or small group to work on their reading goals on their IEP. Accommodations and modifications, just like a 504 plan, an IEP can include accommodations and modifications that would help the student learn the same as their peers. An example would be like extended time on a test. That's a pretty common one you'll see. So when we're comparing the 504 plan versus the IEP, both IEP and 504 plan have accommodations and modifications that would allow the student to participate in learning. The big difference is the IEP has that specially designed instruction, which the 504 plan does not. So if the student needs small group, instruction with a teacher to reach a discrete academic goal, an IEP is the document that would deliver that service. There are also some other interventions. I don't want to overlook this. Schools can provide academic or social emotional interventions to students without an IEP or a 504 plan through MTSS. Sorry for all the acronyms. MTSS stands for Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. And just another little note here, schools can't delay an evaluation because they want to do MTSS first and just wait and see. They can do the multi-tiered system of support as part of the data gathering process for the IEP, but they can't delay the evaluation due to doing MTSS. All right, and then questions on that section. So that's just my IEP basics section. Any questions there?
I don't see any right now.
We'll give them a second so I can catch my breath.
One of them popped up, Emily. ETR question, if a child has received a new diagnosis, can a school delay their own evaluation to trial accommodations?
Yes. Short answer, yes. It all depends. If the new diagnosis is like something that the school like wouldn't have even considered, like what would be a good example? The student has a diagnosis where it's just a physical limitation and they're in a wheelchair, but they have a new diagnosis that's saying, oh, they also have like dyslexia and they need reading support. In that case, the school absolutely should do a new evaluation because they need to explore an entirely new area that they probably weren't looking at before. However, if the new diagnosis isn't that different from their old diagnosis, let's say they have an autism diagnosis and the school's done extensive evaluations on, you know, behavior, social, emotional, blah, blah, blah. And then they get an additional diagnosis of like sensory processing disorder. They might have already looked at that as part of the autism diagnosis. So in that case, the school might not need to do a whole new evaluation. So I guess the answer actually is it depends.
It depends. And probably whether or not it would require specially designed instruction.
Yeah. But yeah, if the school, you know, wants to tackle things with accommodations, they can. But if you're thinking that the new diagnosis is going to have significant educational impacts, I would push for an evaluation. Any other questions before we move on to the advocacy section?
Don't see any.
All right. You can always ask them later. So let's talk about advocacy. This is important because we know all this stuff about the law now. How are we going to make sure that the school is actually doing what they should be doing? How are we going to make sure that I'm communicating my needs with the school? That's where advocacy comes in. So I first wanted to talk about the role of a parent advocate. Parent advocates are a very unique subset of advocates because you're the parent of the student. You have this unique insight into their needs, and obviously you care about them a lot. So it's a very unique position to be in. The biggest role of a parent advocate would be to support the student, I would say. A lot of times, you know, parents have in their mind the idea of what they want their students to do, but they're not actually talking with their children about what do you actually need. I think that piece can be really integral to making a strong IEP and making sure that your student is successful. So I would push all parents to support your students. That's your number one goal. What are their needs? How can I support them in school? How can I communicate to them? How can I make sure they're the best they're going to be? The other big role of a parent advocate is to do their research. And that means learn about the law as much as you're like able to, but also make sure you're reading the IEPs, make sure you're paying attention during those school meetings, make sure you're reviewing the evaluation, make sure you're caught up on what all the data is, what's going on at school, and what the relevant laws are applicable to your student. The other thing that I think is really important for a parent advocate to do is to share their expertise. And a lot of times I'm speaking with parents and they don't recognize that they have this expertise. They're just like, well, I'm not a medical practitioner. I'm not a teacher. The school's never going to listen to me. That's not true because, like I said, parents, they have a very unique position and they do have expertise on the strengths and needs of their children. They actually are the experts on their kids. So sharing that knowledge about your unique knowledge about your student is a really key component of being a parent advocate. Another big role of any advocate in general, but also a parent advocate, is to preserve and improve your relationship with the school whenever possible. It's important to remember when working with schools, you're in it for the long haul, unfortunately. Your kid's enrolled in school until they graduate, and you should try and make sure that the relationship with the school is good as much as possible so you can keep getting good outcomes for your student. So let's go into all that in a little more detail. How can we support our students? Let's be a good advocate by supporting your student to grow into their own self-advocate. So what does that mean? Encouraging your student to be able to speak up about things that they need themselves. And an easy way to do that is to get your student involved in the IEP process as much as possible. It's kind of like a good training ground for when they're adults and they're going to have to, tell people, here are my needs. This is an accommodation I need. They're going to have to do this stuff as adults. So let's start practicing now in the IEP meeting. You can attend IEP meetings together. Sometimes I'll be working with students who maybe due to anxiety or whatever, they don't want to be in the IEP meeting. You can ask them just to attend the first part of the IEP meeting, just to like say hi to everyone and express what their needs are. You can also ask them to write a letter to the IEP team, expressing their wishes or needs. If the student can't write a letter, you can also, get them to dictate just a couple bullet points like, oh, he was interested in this. He wants to know more about this. He's concerned about this. Just get something in writing from the student. You should also review your IEP together with your student to make sure that you guys are all on, you're on board. So your student knows what to expect from school and kind of knows what the IEP even looks like. This can help in the future. A lot of times I'll get parents who are concerned that the school isn't performing the IEP, but they don't really know. But if your student, knows what's in the IEP, knows what to expect, your student would be able to communicate with you. Hopefully, there's an issue here, something's not happening that should be happening. Also discuss with the student what works for them in school and what doesn't work. So going into an IEP meeting and being able to say like, hey, I spoke with my child. This is not working for him. We're looking at solutions like this. That's really powerful. And also it's going to help out, your actual child, your student in the future. The reason why this is so important, I kind of mentioned this earlier, is because in the future, your student's going to be expected to do this stuff on their own, and you want to prepare them as much as possible. So in college, there are no IEPs, but you can request reasonable accommodations. However, the student has to request their own reasonable accommodations. So that's something to look forward to, pretty soon if your student's going to graduate and go to college. As an adult, adults also at work have to request their own accommodations. So that's a great thing to practice early.
Emily, there's a question.
Yes.
Not necessarily on the slide, but it's going back to the suspected disability. There was a question about how this works with homeschool students.
Yeah, so with homeschool students, the parents can reach out to the school district and say, I, suspect my student has a disability. Keeping in mind, even if this school says, yes, your student is eligible for an IEP, if you're enrolled as a homeschooled parent, the school has no obligation to perform that IEP. So you can go through the whole process, the evaluation, get an IEP, but then it's just kind of like a document that's sitting there and not being used. However, if you do decide to return to the school district, your public school district, you would have that IEP in place for the future. So I don't know, it's kind of like depending on what your long-term plans are. If the student's never going to go to a public school, I don't know if it's that essential to get an IEP. But if you do have plans, it's probably a good idea to get identified ASAP. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yep, that's it. Thank you, Emily.
Okay, how do I change the slide? Here we go. All right, the second piece of being a good advocate is knowing about data. So all special education supports should be individualized based on a student's specific needs. How are we going to determine what the student's specific needs are? We're going to use data. So any decision that the IEP team is making, they need to base it on data. What is data? It's the assessments like that ETR. It can be state and district testing results. It could be rating scales, observations by teachers or by the parent, private evaluations if the parents, pursued that route, and then interviews with the parent and the student. If data is not available, you can advocate that the school collect that data. So a good example of this, let's say a student needs a communication device, but the school doesn't know what type of device will work best for him. And so they're just kind of throwing up their hands and being like, well, we can't figure out what works, so we're just not going to do anything. You can request an assistive technology evaluation that the school would perform that would then determine which device is appropriate for that student based on their needs and their abilities. Using data is kind of like the key to being a good advocate. So if you are requesting something happen as part of the IEP, you want to have supporting data. Unfortunately, a lot of times a family is not going to have formal data the same way a school does, but here's some ideas for how we can gather formal data to help make your request as strong as possible. So we talked about re-evaluations earlier. So you can always ask the school to do a re-evaluation if you think there's new data out there. If the school is saying no to that, or they're not doing it, you can request an independent educational evaluation. So this is where the school would pay for a third party to gather data. You can also bring in like informal data, so like parent observations. Like I said, as a parent, you are an expert on your child. Your observations are their own form of data. And students can, provide data on themselves on what they actually want. Student testimony is informal data. Other examples of outside data would be like medical information, like a doctor's note or a medical diagnosis or assessment. Sometimes I've seen families, they'll like actually bring the student's counselor or whoever to the meeting to talk about, this is stuff we're working on, this is what I've noticed. That's a form of data. You can also re-evaluate pre-existing school data. So going through that ETR again and seeing, is there anything I missed? Is there anything I don't think the school, analyzed correctly? Is there anything the school didn't follow up on? That can be data you can use as well. Another big piece of being an advocate is communicating properly. And just a heads up, this is where we're going to get a little interactive on the next slide. So the first step to communicating with the school is deciding what's the best venue to communicate. And I see a lot of people being tripped up on this. Oh, there's a question, is there?
Yeah, it is, can we watch? Yes, this is being recorded.
Everything is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website sometime soon, I hope, in the future. So communicating with the school, the first step is just choosing the best venue for how you want to communicate. I see a lot of parents get tripped up on this and they try to convey too much information over email, or they're conveying really formal information that we want to follow up on via the phone, and then it just gets forgotten. Or we're going to an IEP meeting to kind of say nothing. So email is a great way to convey information formally so it can be revisited later. And so you have a record of the communication. So big things like, I want to request an evaluation for my student, absolutely convey that in writing because you want the school to follow up on it. Do not call someone on the phone and say, I want to request an evaluation and get like oh yeah, sure, we can look into that. Hang up the phone and think, all right, problem solved. People don't always keep notes from phone calls. So make sure you're doing everything in writing. Phone calls, however, are really good for conveying a lot of information quickly. So like, we're coming back from summer break. I want to catch you up on what we got up to this summer. We did X, Y, Z. Also building rapport and having more informal exchanges. So like working more collaboratively over the phone. Maybe don't convey the most formal information or requests, but you can have a longer conversation on the phone. However, if you want anything that needs IEP team attention, so like you want to update the IEP, you want to make a formal decision about services, you need to have an IEP meeting to get that done. So the way you would have an IEP meeting is usually I would just email and say, let's have an IEP meeting. When can you guys schedule that? Another big thing about communicating with the school is keeping things brief and to the point. Teachers have a lot of work to do. And if you're sending them long emails or you're taking up a lot of their time, their attention is wandering. And so you have to be like, listen, I have 5 minutes of your attention. I'm going to tell you everything I need up front so you can understand what I need. Another thing that I use a lot is what's called like a compliment sandwich. This helps with building rapport and it keeps everyone in a great mood. So you open up your communication with a compliment. Thank you so much for, telling me that Johnny lost his, book at school yesterday. I really appreciate that. It doesn't have to be a big compliment. Here's what we need to, get done, blah, blah, blah. And then you end the communication by saying like, thanks so much again. I really appreciate your time. And it just really bookends the communication in such a nice way. And it makes people more excited and willing to work with you. Another big thing about communicating with the school is assuming good intentions. Sometimes schools don't have good intentions, but if you're assuming negative intentions when there are none, things can quickly spiral out of control and get super negative super fast. So to keep interactions as positive as possible, I always like to assume, ignorance instead of maliciousness. So maybe there have been mistakes in the past. I'm just going to say, I just assume you guys, you weren't being mean to me. Maybe you just didn't have all the information. I'm going to be the bigger person. I'm going to assume good intentions and move on from there. Another big piece is communicate with the person who can actually enact the change you're requesting. Sometimes you're communicating with the wrong person who doesn't have any power to do anything about your situation. And no wonder you feel like you're beating your head against a wall because you are. That person is not getting you where you need to be. So figuring out who you actually need to communicate with about your issues. And that's going to be different in every school, but typically your intervention specialist is probably a good start, or your special education director. I would not reach out to the superintendent as the first person you're going to reach out to about an issue, because they don't really know what's going on in your personal situation. So keeping all that in mind, I want you to look at 2 emails. And we're going to look at these 2 and say, what do they do differently? And why is one more successful than the other? All right, so the first email is, Dear Superintendent, I can't believe it has been 4 years of this mess. In 2023, the school did not provide me the services Mary needed, despite me attending every meeting and begging them otherwise. In 2024, Mary had more troubles in school, and still no one has helped me. Your school has set Mary up to fail just because you don't like me. Now here we are, and things are only getting worse for Mary. I need the school to fix things for Mary ASAP, and if you do not, I will be filing a lawsuit against you. The other night, Mary told me she didn't want to come to school anymore. We are begging for you to fix this, but no one seems to be listening. Martha. There's email number 1. Let's look at email number 2, which is, it's going to be the same situation, but the parent has phrased things a little differently. Dear current IS, thanks for all the updates you have been sending. You may have noticed lately that Mary has been struggling more with school. I spoke with her and she told me she was finding her academic work difficult. It didn't feel like she was getting support from her teachers. I think we should have an IEP meeting to discuss how we can best support her. Mary thinks the following things might help. More math tutoring, having her work broken down into smaller chunks. Please let me know when the IEP team can meet to discuss, and if you have any other ideas. Thank you again for all that you do, Martha. All right, if anyone wants to jump in Q&A or raise their hand in chat, let me know, why do you think one of these emails is more successful than the other? And I'll give you guys some time while I sip some water.
And I'm watching the Q&A for you, Emily.
You can also participate, Tammy and Kristen, if you want to.
Oh, you don't want me to participate on this one. We'll leave it for everybody else.
Well, I would just
Oh.
say that, well, let's see what the Q&A says.
You want to do the Q&A first? One
Yes.
seems like an attack. That's a good answer. Oh, they're pouring in now. 2 is better because they're contacting the correct person, attempting to have an IEP meeting, and explaining exactly what their daughter's needs are. And then you were going to say something, Kristen.
I was going to say that number 2 has that nice compliment sandwich.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
That's
I tried
right.
to make two examples, one doing everything that I would advise a parent not to do, and one doing everything, all the advice that I just gave a parent. So like Shakira said, one seems like an attack. Why does it seem like an attack? Because it kind of is. They're not saying anything positive about the school. They're not being nice to their new school team. They're saying you failed me in the past. There's also like a lack of assuming, assuming negative intentions, assuming that you've done things badly to my student intentionally because you don't like me. That's a really bad headspace for a parent to be in. And honestly, reading email number 1, my heart breaks for this parent because it's clear that something is super wrong. She's saying Mary doesn't want to come to school anymore. Something's going on in that student's life, but she's not telling us what's going on. So it's really hard for someone to read this and say like, okay, I know how to fix this. Also, she sent this to the superintendent, who, like, how many emails do you think a superintendent gets a day? They probably got this and they're like shrugging their shoulders like, well, sounds like this person's life sucks. All right, moving on to the next one. The biggest
Emily,
issue, yes.
One of the things that just was glaringly obvious for me, and the second one that I really pulled me, was Mary thinks the following things might help. And so we're building that self-advocacy as well and talking to the student.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There's some good ones in here. She's threatening legal action. That's no good.
Yeah. Dear Comms, if you want to keep these up a little longer so people can see what other people have said.
Okay.
Yeah. So I changed it. Where'd it go?
Emily, sorry, I just wanted to mention the attendees can't see the responses unless they have been answered. So that's why I'm popping them out.
Oh, okay. Never mind. That makes sense.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Good call out though.
All right. So yes. Everything that's been said, absolutely yes. Threatening a lawsuit, that's going to put the school in the back foot and maybe make them less willing to work with you and collaborate with you. Not being specific in the first one. What does the second one do well? Kristen pointed out the compliment sandwich. Tammy pointed out the fact that it's clear the parent has actually talked with the student about what's going on and has some ideas for, maybe the student has even offered these themselves, some ideas for how to fix things. This is also kind of a small thing, but bullet points. I always think bullet points are so helpful in expressing information in a way that people can get the gist of it quickly. Like if I'm an overworked teacher and I'm scrolling through my emails, I might skip over this whole first paragraph, but I see 2 bullet points here with like discrete things that we can get in place. And I'm like, absolutely, we can do that. There's also a call to action, which there is not on the first one. The first one is like, I'm having a lot of bad feelings about this, but there's no like request for what can we do next to fix this? It's just saying like, you need to fix this now. The second one, there's a request. Can we have an IEP meeting to discuss? Then you're setting yourself up to like have a productive meeting with the team. Another thing that the parent put in here that I like is, please let me know when the IEP team can meet to discuss. And if you have any other ideas, you're opening the door to this team to collaborate with you.
Emily, and that's
Q&A?
somebody else put in there. So right on your point, number 2 invites the school into a collaborative situation.
Yes, absolutely.
So, yeah. And then there is another question, but it's not on the side. Do you want me to hold it or do you want?
Yeah, let's hold it. I think I've said everything I want to say about these 2 emails, but if anyone has any other thoughts on the emails, please let me know.
Not right now.
I guess I have one other thing to mention. The parents mentioning a lot about past school years in the first email. It's important to know about things that have happened in the past so you can prevent the mistakes of the past. But I always encourage parents, like, we need to look towards the future. How are we going to fix things starting from now? And sometimes if you're overly focusing on negative things that have happened in the past, it can prevent collaboration and growth for the future. So that's just something else I wanted people to see in those emails. All right, we do have a question from Matthew Dolan. Tammy, if you want to read that out.
That was the one I was asking you if you wanted me to hold. But it's about compensatory services and what the policy rates are going forward for deficits of service minutes remaining from the lack of related services during the pandemic. Or for that matter, how to follow up with with the SD regarding services not provided post-pandemic due to lack of staffing.
I don't know who the SD would be.
I
I'm
think
not
school
sure.
district. Probably school
district.
School
district.
district.
Out of fault with the school district regarding services not provided due to lack of staffing. So the pandemic 2020 was like 5 years ago. So in special education, there is a statute of limitations on like dispute resolution. So if you just now want to like reach out to the school and say, hey, they didn't get services in 2020, you wouldn't be able to like file a complaint right now oh, Matthew Dillon has raised a hand. Actually, yes, let's listen. Matthew, if you want to speak, you can, I think. I don't know. Do I have that ability?
I don't.
Allow to talk. There it is.
I got it. You should be able to speak now, Matthew.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. There's been some discussion. I just tried to word the question plainly so it could apply to all people. But we've been in contact with our SD school district, yes, about some of the lack of services since the pandemic, during the pandemic, and we followed up with them, but we still seem to be not meeting those missed minutes or missed obligations. And separately, the second part of the question had to do with the fact that recently this school year, our student was not given his speech minutes due to a lack of staffing, and we actually weren't notified until almost the end of the school year, and tried to get some help with that for ESY, but that kind of failed to materialize. So I'm just curious as to you mentioned the statute of limitations. We've been kind of documenting this, not completely thoroughly, but mentioned in IEP meetings, mentioned with our specialist at school. And I just wondered, what the general information was in terms of what happens with those balances from the deficits at the IEP, or what
I
people are finding.
appreciate you raising your hand and asking this question. This might be one of those questions that you might want to call us so you can get more specific advice about your situation.
Sure.
The short
Yeah.
answer is that compensatory education is a way that schools can remedy a FAPE violation. So if the school isn't providing a free, appropriate public education, they
Right.
can offer a compensatory education to put that student in the same position that they would have been had the instruction originally been performed. So there's obviously a lot of factors there. The student may
Sure.
have missed out on services, but if there's no effect on the student, then maybe the student isn't due compensatory education. Also, I don't know what the history of your communications with the school is, but if you have something formal in writing that says the school's going to deliver X comp ed, you've been following up with the school within the statute of limitations and it has not been performed, there might be a basis there for a complaint or further dispute resolution. But
Okay.
I do think you might want to call one of us and get more information.
Sure. Yeah. No, they definitely will do that. I just wondered if there was, like you said, the statute of limitations and whether it affected the student. I understand all that. I just wondered if there was an across the board, schools have to make up these minutes or else, that kind of thing.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no obligation that says
Okay.
schools have to do X. It is one of the potential remedies, though, for a FAPE violation.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. All right, we're gonna close off on those tail two emails. Thank you everyone for participating in that. I really appreciated your thoughts on that. And now we're gonna move to the last part of being a good advocate is focusing on collaborative negotiation. So we're gonna get into like some negotiation speak here, but I think it's a good way to differentiate between two types of negotiating. Interest-based bargaining versus positional bargaining. So positional bargaining is when you're telling the school that you need something this rate. Johnny needs a one-on-one aid. Interest-based bargaining is when you're focusing on an actual issue that you need support with. Johnny needs additional adult supervision to stay safe. And one, you're making that one-on-one aid. The only thing you're asking for, the only thing you want, make it or break it, we need a one-on-one aid. And the second one, you're saying, we need Johnny to stay safe. How are we going to achieve that? To make that request even stronger, you can support it with data. Like Johnny's eloped from the classroom 5 times last month. How are we going to solve that issue? I put a link here for our negotiation skills for parents manual as well. If you're interested in learning more about negotiating with the school, communicating with the school, all that good stuff, it's a very thorough guide. And I actually read it when I first started here and it got me started in learning how to negotiate. So I really recommend it to everyone. The benefits of an interest-based bargaining is there's no more zero-sum negotiations. So if your ask is Johnny needs a one-on-one aid, you're either going to get an aid or you don't. And if you don't get an aid, you're probably going to be pretty upset. However, if you're asking for Johnny to stay safe, you might get something that is going to make Johnny safe. It might not be a one-on-one aid, but it might be something that makes everyone in the room comfortable. You also preserve your relationship with the school this way because we're not having any more of those zero-sum games. And you're making sure that the needs of Johnny are being placed first. So Johnny needs to stay safe. How are we going to achieve that? It opens up opportunities for discussion, collaboration, and consensus with the group. So the group can brainstorm, are there options other than an aid that would actually fit Johnny's needs better? What are the potential drawbacks of an aid? Because believe it or not, there are some negatives for a student having an aid around them all the time. It might impact their relationships with their peers. Having that conversation with the team really opens up if you use the interest-based bargaining. Another big thing when you're negotiating is to develop the action items. So in those emails earlier, we had an action item, let's have an IEP meeting. Sometimes though, in your IEP meetings, you might not get the outcome you want, but you might be able to work towards a certain outcome. So the easiest outcome in an IEP meeting is everyone says yes to everything you ask for, and it all gets out of the IEP, and you're happy. The more difficult outcome is the school saying no, but there's usually a but attached. No, we're not going to do that because we don't have any data right now that the student needs that. No, we're not going to do that, but we'll see how the year goes. You're going to want to follow up and figure out how are there ways that we can turn this no but into a yes if you really truly believe that it should be a yes. So if they don't have the data right now, that's, doors open. Let's collect some data. You can ask the school to collect data. You can request your own data. Or you can share data if you have data that the school doesn't have. No, but we'll see how the year goes. Make sure there's a way to measure how the year is going. IEP goals, they're automatically being measured. I mean, hopefully, if your school's filling out those progress reports, the IEP goals are being measured. But you can also schedule check-ins with the school, schedule follow-up meetings, keep track on your own about how things are going, or ask the school to do additional data measuring on their own. Make sure every action item is recorded in a prior written notice. This is another big thing. Anytime the school is agreeing to do anything, you want to make sure that that is being put in writing and is kept on record somewhere. So if you're in an IEP meeting and the school's saying like, yeah, we can try that. We don't want to put it in the IEP though. Say, okay, well, let's put it in the prior written notice. We're going to try this for a 2-week trial period just so we have it on record. You also want to make sure if the school's saying no to something, it's in the prior written notice as well. So in the future, if you ever want to pursue dispute resolution, you have a record that there was a no to this question that you asked. I think we might skip the workshop because we're running short on time. And we're going to go to our back to school tips in the last 10 minutes here. So I honestly had a really hard time developing these back to school tips because as we've, come to understand just during these few questions, the experiences in special education are they're varied and they're broad, but I tried to find a couple that I think could be common to every family. My first recommendation for parents going back to school is to review the current IEP. I'd also recommend you introduce yourself to new school staff members, give them summer updates about whatever has changed over the summer, communicate effectively from the jump. That also helps with like rapport building, and then prepare and be patient because sometimes you might not be ready to jump straight into an IEP meeting, but you can definitely start preparing for one. So reviewing the current IEP, I would review it with your students just to make sure that everyone's on the same page with what's on the IEP. I would really look for anything on the IEP that you didn't expect to be there, or if you really think that something is on the IEP and it's missing, make a note of that. Sometimes I will get calls from parents who are like insisting, we have this support, it's in his IEP, and then we will look at his IEP together and it is not there. Make sure that you know what's in the IEP and make sure your child knows what to expect because that can help your student be more comfortable during the school year. And that can also help down the line. If a service isn't being provided like you thought it would, maybe your student can let you know. Also introduce yourself to your new team, start building that rapport. Some ideas I've seen are like an all about me letter where parents will write like a little one pager like, hi, my name is Josh. It's about their student. I really like baseball, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes they'll include like a cute picture. You can also introduce yourself in person to your teachers, attend the school events if they have like a parent teacher night, introduce yourself there. I used to have like an art night. It was a fun place to meet the teachers. Summer updates, if there are any significant changes over the summer, like if there's a new diagnosis or if there are new strengths or challenges, like, wow, we've gotten really good at this skill, but I'm noticing a lot of issues with this skill, communicate those with your team. If there are significant changes that might require an IEP amendment, request an IEP team meeting. Amendment. Communicate effectively. Use those communication tips that I gave you to foster that positive and collaborative communication with your school. Communicate them, be transparent with them. If there are concerns at home, if you have concerns about what happened last year, I wouldn't, put it in a long, like multi-page email saying like, this was wrong, this was wrong, this was wrong. I would just say like, hey, it's so nice to meet you guys. I was concerned about this last year. I'm hoping that we don't repeat that. I just want everybody to be on the same page. We're seeing this at home. Stuff like that is a really appropriate communication and can help foster that collaborative atmosphere with your team. Prepare and be patient. A lot of parents, they want to request an IEP meeting, first week back from school. Things didn't go well last year. We need to change things. We need to have a meeting ASAP. However, if there's no data to support changing the IEP, then that meeting is probably premature. And a lot of times during the first week of school, you have no estimation of how your kid's going to do the rest of the school year. We see it both ways. We see kids who really struggle when they start in school, but then later, they get more adjusted to things and they perform better. Or we see like the honeymoon kids who like they start out school year amazing, they're doing so great, and then it comes like October, November, and everything comes crashing down. So you might want to be a little patient when it comes to predicting how the school year is going to go from a student. That being said, if there have been years upon years upon years where, oh, we know he's a honeymooner, we know in October we're going to see this exact issue because we've seen it happen every year, that is something you definitely can have an IEP meeting about to say, like, how can we get supports in place to make sure this doesn't happen this year? Make sure you're prepared to reach out to the team immediately if there's an issue in school, so you can start that preparation just by keeping that open, consistent communication with the school. Hopefully it's both ways. The school's communicating with you, you're communicating with them. Also keep your own notes of areas of potential concern, just so you have those to refer to later. You can also schedule regular check-ins with the team if you want, with like your teacher, with the IS, and then really just sit back and let the team get to know your student. You don't know how the year's going to go. It might be the best year ever. You never know. Just give them the chance to build that rapport and see what happens. And that's it for my advocacy and back to school tips. We have 5 minutes for questions. If anyone has questions, lay them on me. I noticed we have something in the chat. Transparency was huge when I was in IS. It was always so hard if a parent held their stress from another year or another IS that I didn't know about until that October breakdown. Yes, I think it's kind of a balancing act, because I understand on one side, it's like, I do want to have a good year this year. So we're just going to ignore what happened last year. And we're going to go into this, happy and ready to succeed. But you might catch some people off guard. So just being transparent. Maybe you're not asking for anything. You just want people to know, like, we do struggle this time of year. We might see something. Any questions?
Do not see any right now. But what a great presentation, Emily. So many helpful tips.
Yeah, it was a broad presentation, but hopefully it gave everyone kind of like the refresher you needed to get started this school year. I hope you have a great school year. I know I got some kids going back to school next week. So it's time. We're going back to school, guys. Get ready.
It's definitely a good refresher. And we just got in the chat, Lindsay just put in the chat, in our chat, that the recording from, I think everybody should be able to see this from your last presentation if they want to review that as well. So I don't see any, well, nope, we got a couple. Very good information to get started for the school year, just some feedback, and thank you for the presentation. So Emily, I think you did a good job just getting everything we needed in there. So I just want to tell everybody, thank you all for joining us today for this session of our summer education and employment series. Again, we hope you found the information helpful and that you're leaving with some practical tools as parents, professionals, and insights that you can use moving forward. Again, please don't hesitate, like Emily said, to reach out if there was more specific questions you need. You can reach out through our intake online, and we do have a phone number. You can find that on our website. And so we're always happy to support you further. And as a reminder, like we said, today's session will be recorded and posted on the website soon. Feel free to revisit it if you need to refresh or share it with others that might use or have a benefit from that. So we hope you will join us for our next session next week, which will take place on August 12th. And I believe that will be Social Security for transition aged use. So thank you everyone for spending this Tuesday with us, and hopefully we'll see you back here next week. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Bye.
Emily.